Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Small was very small. Probably the smallest person you've ever seen in your whole life, and perhaps the smallest person you've ever seen in your whole life, because he was so small, you wouldn't see him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big at all. Perhaps we should say that Mr. Small was as small as a pin. Mr. Small lived in a small house underneath a daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's cottage. It was a very nice house, although very tiny. It suited Mr. Small perfectly. He liked living there. Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of job could Mr. Small do? After all, there are many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but haven't had any ideas. Not one. He was thinking about it now while he was having lunch. He was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought, while he was eating his big lunch, but there was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself. After lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice. So after lunch, he left his house and walked to Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there he stopped for rest. He sat on a pebble feeling quite out of breath. A worm crawled by and stopped. Good morning, Mr. Small, said the worm. Good morning, Walter, said Mr. Small to the worm, whom he knew quite well. Out for a walk, are you? Asked Walter. Going to see Mr. Robinson, replied Mr. Small. Oh, said Walter. About a job, added Mr. Small. Oh, said Walter the worm again, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked all the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up the steps of Mr. Robinson's back door. He knocked at the door. Nobody heard him. He knocked again at the door. No one heard him. The trouble is, you see, that if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very long loud knock. Mr. Small looked up. There, Hive said his doorbell. How come I ring the bell when I can't reach it? Thought Mr. Small to himself. He started to climb the rope, brick by brick, to reach the bell. He had climbed up one place and he made the mistake of liking that. Oh dear, he said and fell. Bang! Ouch, said Mr. Small, rubbing his head. Just then, Mr. Small heard footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. Hello, said the voice. The postman looked up. Hello, he said to Mr. Small. Who are you? I'm Mr. Small, said Mr. Small. Will you ring the bell for me? Of course I will, replied the postman. In answer to Mr. Small's question, and reaching out, he pressed the bell with his finger. Thank you, said Mr. Small. My pleasure, said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard footsteps coming to the door. The door opened. Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. That's funny, he said. I sure heard somebody ring the bell. He was about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. Hello, said the voice. Hello, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson looked down and down. Hello, he said. What are you doing here? I've come to ask your advice, said Mr. Small to Mr. Robinson. Well, said Mr. Robinson, you better come in and have a talk. Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson to the house and perched there on Mr. Robinson's favorite chair. He told him about it. He couldn't think of a job that he couldn't do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of tea and listened. So you can see, Mr. Small exclaimed, how difficult it is. Yes, I can see that, said Mr. Robinson, but leave it to me. Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a restaurant and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard into mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling the pots and getting covered in mustard, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a sweet shop and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving candy. But Mr. Small kept doing the candy jar, so he kept that job. Right, McGillicuddy. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting matches into boxes. But Mr. Small kept getting shut in the boxes in the bed, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked at a farm and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, so to get the brown eggs with the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he left that job. What are you going to do for you? Mr. Robinson asked Mr. Small one evening. Don't know, said Mr. Small in a small voice. I've got one more idea, said Mr. Robinson. I know somebody who writes children's books. Perhaps you should work for him. So the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. Could I work for you? Mr. Small asked the man. Yes, you can, replied the man. Pass me the pencil to tell you what the jobs you've been doing. I'll write a book about it. I'll call it Mr. Small, he added. But children don't want to read a book all about me, exclaimed Mr. Small. Yes, they will, replied the man. They'll like it very much. And you did. Didn't you? Nope, boy, that's far movies. How come you read stories again? This is version 2. This other guy is sitting in Van Halen, and this is Motley Crue. I'd like to chicken. You fat me. Folks. Okay, you fat.